Today, I thought we'd have a conversation.
Gabriel's Gospel Grace, changing lives and kingdom building one stone at a time.
Good morning to you, and it's good to be back after a short recess. So today I thought we'd have a chat, a conversation, because we're in a time now where I see the art of conversations dying, and that's for lots of reasons. And that's kind of what I want to talk about on this particular episode of Motivational Monday. See, conversation, people sometimes refer to it as an art, and I think it is. And I think since the global lockdown due to COVID, people re-socializing, I suppose, it's not quite been the same. I think people were apprehensive about catching, the illness. And then there was the matter of people having different opinions about the kind of treatments. And then people lost family. And people's mental health have been affected by lockdowns. People lost their jobs. They lost friends. They lost family. But mainly for difference of opinion. And then it's got to a place now where people just learn to self-censor. Not talk about particular topics or subjects. Fear of being cancelled. But like many things, especially media-driven and politically driven, often it's an illusion. It's an illusion to create this exact feeling that, if you say the wrong thing, you'll be cancelled. That only really happens if you've got a big platform and you're already followed by hundreds and thousands of people. However, we are in a time now of a sort of surveillance society, especially with regards to online presence, where perhaps something you say today will be used against you in a year's time or 2 years' time. So perhaps when we're publicly broadcasting anything, we need to be mindful that what we're talking about is something we can still stand behind in the future and not simply think about where we are today emotionally or our particular views on things. Because even in the last few years, I've seen people's views swing left and right and upside down, and opinions have flipped backwards and forwards. But in the meantime, what we found is that clearly people now don't have true conversations anymore. They censor what they think. Often it leads to saying less. But if we're saying less, then who are we listening to? You see, the problem is that we're not listening to each other anymore. What does a local constituency think about a certain matter? Chances are the opinion's never even getting through to their elected representative, because even within the community they don't talk anymore. They don't share an opinion with fear of being labelled some sort of badge that's been created, a narrative that implies if you think one particular thing, you must align with a particular group of people. So I know people that are probably quite supportive and loving towards the LGBT community. But because they are, then they're seen as being 100% in agreement with everything that activist community put out there. I should also clarify that I do have friends and people that are LGBT personally, and they do not identify with the media's portrayal of the LGBTQ++ community. That's a very small minority of the said community. So their views are being touted and shouted and promoted is the loudest, but that doesn't actually represent its own people. And that's happening across the whole of society now. Even Christians don't talk about Christianity anymore. In fact, I'm well aware, even in the town I actually currently have my office, that Christianity is played down so little that I've had people come to me asking if any of the churches are still active, which sadly they are, but they seem to feel that speaking out or advertising is somehow broadcasting and hurting people's feelings. And I think that's sad, because people have the power of choice. God gave people the power of choice. It's part of that freedom. So if people choose not to go to church, that's fine. But if people don't go to a church because they're not even aware of one, because of potentially offending people, that's a lie. That's not truth. And that's where we're going in this conversation this morning. So let's talk about communication. How does it work? I know it sounds like a silly question, but you can kind of see this with whether you're dealing with animals or babies, because you have to create some form of dialogue. And clearly language is a barrier. So communication isn't always about language. Language is more of a high functioning aspect of communication. But the basics are quite simple. And I used to teach this to students I used to work with. Because I used to work with students with learning disabilities. and often special needs. And they found it hard to communicate, not because necessarily their ideas were hard to articulate, but actually the people hearing the ideas would often take their own spin or perception of what was said. And of course, that's not communication. So communication, fundamentally and basic, is I have a thought or idea in my head, and I need to translate that to you the best way I can. Now, okay, some people say perhaps we can use telepathy. And I think in some cases we can mentally, through the supernatural, convey our thoughts. We can certainly do it through other mediums, such as music. Music will create an atmosphere or a thought or a mood and a feeling. So communication isn't purely limited to language. But what happens is, whatever my thought is in my head, I need you not only to receive it, but to understand it. So to do that, I simply have to transmit one form or another, whether it's vocally, whether I send you a letter, whether I send you an email, whether I post this video. I am communicating, I am transmitting to you. I hope it's articulating in a way that you can understand. But as we've just mentioned, language can be a barrier. But so can understanding words and phrases. They can carry very different meanings. And in this topsy-turvy world today, sadly, that's exactly what happens. Often words are misinterpreted or actually misunderstood from the point of view that actual meaning, dictionary definition, is now ignored by some new popular version of the definition. So let's have an example of this. And I used to use this one with my students. If I arrived at your door and you welcome me in and say, "How are you today, Gabriel?" And I say, "I feel like a winter's morning." What does that mean? What have you received? How would you know what I've said? Well, the obvious thing is we have to find out. So we have to verify that communication. Now, in electronics, everything we transmit, we have something called parity handshaking and all these other modes of coding and communication protocols that we use, which is exactly that. When something's sent as a packet of data, there's always something sent back just to confirm, is this what I was supposed to receive? So in this conversation, the best thing is for you to confirm that. Now, me saying I feel like a winter's morning, that's purely left to your interpretation. So you might come back with, as was often the case, "Oh no, so you feel cold and damp and alone and sad." And my reply would be, no, the opposite. As a child, I lived in Canada, and them cold, frosty, crisp, snowy mornings where you could smell the coffee in the air and the blue sky, it was fresh, made you feel alive. So you see that? Total misunderstanding, even when there's good parity checking. But that's the point. At least I've clarified that to you now. So now you've learned something about me, and you've also learned a new meaning to that same definition. Now, the problem though today is everything is now through the media. Every communication, whether it's through YouTube, which I know I'm using, please don't call me a hypocrite, or other social media channels, or mainstream, because then people are leaning towards education, which often points to things like the BBC and other things. And there's many things I know from the real world to be untrue that these organisations often promote as being truthful. I also come from a science background, and I know there's many scientists that disagree with many things that are promoted by mainstream media. But where does that leave you? Well, that means that often you never get to hear any other people's opinions other than the ones that are promoted. And when I was in politics, I can guarantee things like now the Department of Culture and Sport, there are thousands of sports. There is multiple aspects of the word culture. But what you'll find is, where there's a particular narrative or a particular direction things need to head towards, there'll be the stories that are looked for. Now, a good example is our favourite Friday, where I bring you the good news stories of the week. But that's the same for anything. We could literally pick any random sport. Let's say dominoes. Let's say dominoes is our next target. We could go out there and we could find stories to do with dominoes. We could find heart-wrenching stories. We can find stories that totally trigger an emotional response in you. And we can promote them as good news stories. We can say that it improved people's mental health or whatever. And they would do. But the point is, there's still a targeting of a particular narrative which is constantly promoted. But how does that benefit us when there are thousands of other sports and other cultural activities out there? There are millions of people, all with a story to share. You know, I'm currently dealing with and talking to people that are elderly, and the issue of care is coming up quite often at the moment. And I once worked in a care environment, and the one thing I learned from that experience was every person there was a book. Their life stories were fascinating. In fact, some of them you spoke to and you thought this could be a movie, but it's just wasted. Just sitting in a bedroom looking out the window, waiting and waiting patiently. But they've got so much wisdom, so much experience, something that we don't get in the world anymore because it's only promoted communication through mainstream media, social media, and through electronic devices. And as I say, even if you put people in a forum together, there's less real conversation. So my motivation for this video is the opposite. I want people to possibly switch off your devices this week and go and start conversations. Go and have a conversation with someone. Now, part of the conversation is active listening. Now, it's interesting because I know the Bible often says those who have ears hear, and I think that's pretty well what Jesus is referring to in there. It's the fact that we can all sit and listen. In fact, I remember many, many years, as many of you did, sitting in a classroom. We were present. I wasn't deaf. The teacher spoke, and I paid no attention. I was still hearing, but not actively hearing. So actively listening isn't just look at them and focus on them. It's actually listen to the words, let them come into you, let them kind of make sense to you. When they give you an example, see if you can see a reference in your own life that you can pin onto that so that you can relate to it. Or you object to it. That's still fine. The point is you're hearing dialogue. Now, of course, in dialogue, there should be dialogue backwards and forwards. Now, obviously, on this platform, you can leave some comments. It'd be great to speak to you in person. But you see, part of the art of communication, which I think is also why we're not having as much dialogue these days, is because now we're in a place where people don't like disagreement. And I say people, I'm talking all the way up to government now. It's quite evident in the news of this week that there is censorship coming in because of people's opinions and views. You see, I've never had a problem with that because I've always taken the attitude, if someone's views are really negative, right-wing, harmful, fascist, genuine fascist, it speaks for itself. People won't listen to it. You can't convince someone of a lie. Well, you shouldn't be able to convince a majority of people with a lie. But it's much easier if you take away all the other options off the table. You see, people are diverse. When I used to teach, and especially when I did my teacher training, I used to argue that the best resource in the classroom wasn't a smartboard, wasn't the computer, or even the books. It's the students, because they'll have a way of expressing whatever you're talking about, whatever you're teaching, they'll understand it their way and can explain it their way, which makes more sense to the peer sitting next to them than me coming from a much higher level of understanding, trying to bring it down to that introductory foundational level. So my point is, if we really want to grow as a people, and we want to grow as an individual, we need more dialogue with people. We need more diversity of opinion. Now, if we disagree with someone, we don't always have to prove a point and argue about it. I see that too often as well. I certainly see that a lot in Christianity. I find Christians squabbling over details, and actually they're not living the life of Christ because they're too busy trying to pick at the details of which version of the Bible is correct, which is wrong. Now, on Theology Thursday, I'm sure we'll be coming on to a lot of them differences in the Bible, but really it's a bit like a recipe. You know, if I give you the recipe for a Cornish pasty, which for those in America probably don't know what one is, but in the UK it's a very delicate, special little pie that you can't get anywhere else than other than in Cornwall, so I keep being told. But a Cornish pasty, there'll be multiple recipes for that pasty. It's still a Cornish pasty. And I think sometimes we're not sharing our thoughts, our feelings, and our opinions, because we're all trying to conform to be a particular brand of pasty. So the second part of my challenge this week is to have conversations with people. And if someone says something that you disagree with, well, you have a choice. Either simply accept that's their opinion and don't respond, or lovingly and kindly share your opinion back. But don't take the attitude of, well, I'm right, you're wrong, because often there's information that you don't possess. And we found that especially with regards to the certain pandemic. certain things were being said and promoted that afterwards we find are not quite accurate and not quite 100% true. So I think with all truths in that respect, worldly truths, we have to always realise that, like a lot of science, it appears to be the truth and the wisest answer at that time, but is most likely 99% of the time going to change in the future. So being armed with that, it's always good to know other people's opinions. And also, hopefully, they'll bring out something you've never considered before. They might have a personal reason why they have an opinion. Learn that opinion. Grow from it. I was saying whatever subject I'm teaching, whether it's photography, music, politics, faith, coaching, even if you meet someone who's going to teach exactly the topic you just taught on today, go to it, listen, because they might say one thing different and you can learn from that. You can also learn what not to do by watching other people and how they explain things and realise it's not working for them. But the key is dialogue and communication means being present. So go and be present, have a conversation, and don't fear. Because the only way we're going to actually be able to move forward as a society is by diversity of opinion and having that freedom to think what we want and share it. You know, talking our thoughts out loud is not a bad way of dealing with internal problems. In fact, if anything, that's where talking therapies came in. Whether it was a counsellor or a therapist, or even turning the clock back further, people would go and see their parish priest. Not for condemnation, but for sharing, getting it off their chest. See, confession, I know some people still, go to confession. Other people have a friend they confide in. And others even think confession's not even got a place anymore. It's not relevant anymore, especially in certain Christian groups. Now, I'm saying from a legal point of view, as a Christian, it's probably not necessary. But as a human, as a person of the flesh, confession is a good way of offloading that guilt. It's also a good way of talking ideas out. So if we're not in the art of practicing talking openly and communicating with people we trust, then we certainly have a problem that more and more we're going to see an increase in mental health problems, because bottling up thoughts and not having a way of dismantling them, weakening them, and then separating them, they will fester. And words do have power. Even the Bible backs that up. So communication, conversation, having a chat. Now, of course, we also use wisdom. We gauge who we can talk to. It's probably not good to sit with someone of a particular opinion and share your absolute disdain or disagreement with their views, knowing it will cause a reaction. That's not necessary. But if you've got something personal you want to share with someone, perhaps you need to find someone you can trust, who you can confide in, and trust that they will accept that that's your opinion today. Do not judge me on tomorrow, because the reason I'm having this conversation is giving you an opportunity to change my view. That's the beauty of communication. Now, another point is, if you were seeking great wisdom from a wise sage, whether it's a he or she, would you really think it's appropriate to sit there, spend an hour offloading all of your thoughts and they give you an instant answer? Or would it seem wiser that person looks at you and smiles and says, I'll think on that, I'll contemplate the answer, and when I have the right answer, I'll come back to you? Because that's important too, isn't it? That we trust the people that we speak to. We trust that even if we might not be in agreement with them, they will probably give us something to think about, something to challenge us. To challenge us is how we grow. Well, this might be a surprise to some of you, because some of you might say, I don't have that person in my family. I don't have that person in my circle of friends. But for some of you, I don't have friends. Well, speak to God. Silence. But yes, speak to God. You see, I've heard other people say the opposite of what I'm about to say, but God's always listening. God is an active listener. God is always patiently sitting there, waiting to receive. Now, the problem comes is because, especially the way we are today with our technology, I get it all the time now. If someone sends me a text message, bearing in mind I live in an area with no signal, they get so distressed that I haven't got back to them within the hour, let alone the day, because that's what this world is creating now. The technological monster means instant gratification, instant response. You know, neurologists actually prove now that the whole point of TikTok and Twitter and Facebook is dopamine fixes. It is an addiction. People want an instant response all the time. And in fact, the fact they've just put the phone down, they need to know what's changed in the world, what's happened, what's the latest football results, what's happening with Russell Brand, what's going off with all these other things. They need to know now. So they jump straight back on that device again, constantly being fed information. Someone else is speaking and they're listening. But you see, God's patient. As I said, that wise person you're waiting for an answer for, you'd rather it be a calculated answer, a truthful answer, and a powerful answer. Well, God does give that. And he gives it in perfect timing. So an example is, I've gone out today, I've met this amazing woman, and we had this romantic conversation, and we had lunch, and it was amazing. And I think I'm in love, and I think I'm going to go and propose to her now. So I go and sit down with this wise person, let's call them Jesus. And I say, oh, Jesus, I have met this woman. I think she's my wife. She has got to be my wife. She is so pretty. She's smart. She's so present. She gets me. She understands me. Lord, should I go and marry her? Should I go and marry her now? Now, the wisdom of Jesus would clearly be, well, he's in the flesh. His hormones are all over the place. He's on an emotional high. He's feeling on cloud 9. But he hasn't seen her in the true light of day. In fact, this is something I used to quote with my clients who are looking for love. Perhaps the next thing Jesus should say is, tomorrow, have another date, but go shopping at Tesco. Not for nice things, but just do your typical monthly shopping. See what that reveals. And in that time of shopping, you realise how much you've not got in common. How this person now is not dressed up the way they were when you first met them in this amazing first date experience. And then by the end of the week, you go back to Jesus and you say, Jesus, I had this conversation with you, and what's the conclusion, Lord? And at that point, the Lord says, perhaps you need to look at the substance of the person and whether they will be there through thick and thin and they will stand with you to the end, or whether it was all superficial. And at that point, instead of rushing to go and buy a ring and get married, you see the wisdom in that answer, because time has passed to the point that you are now ready to receive. We come back to receiving. Now, it isn't that Jesus said, don't marry them. But the answer had to come at the time when you're willing to listen with a level head, open to receive and open to listen, to be hearing. Now, in the world at the minute, as I've said earlier, platforms, internet, mainstream media, as I said, we can go and find a story from anywhere, but it's what's promoted. So we can pick a theme of dominoes for the week, and every platform can link a story to dominoes. Anything could be linked. It's not hard. But now that means there's a particular narrative being pushed on everybody. But who did that? I've challenged someone once. Someone was telling me about, I think it was the Guardian newspaper. No offence to them. No offence to any tabloid. But if you actually get a copy of that newspaper, get a couple of copies. Actually go through and write the names of every writer. There are even occasions where in one copy they argue one way, in another copy the stories arguing the opposite, and they all happen within the same week. But the average person doesn't even look at the byline, who wrote the article, because they're just doing a job. Interesting, I always like to talk about the journalist versus the reporter, because traditionally, especially if you can find old news footage, there was never an emotional context. It would simply report news. It would report facts and then let you decide what you want to do with those facts. But you see, a journalist by definition often goes into journalism. This is from experience of journalists I know. They go because they have a crusade. They feel there is a purpose and they go looking for the story. They go looking for a particular narrative. Unlike science, or at least how science should be, it's not always balanced, because they'll select particular sources for their information. They may even choose 10 of this source and 3 of that, so that it gives a particular avenue. And in the meantime, if it's wrong or right, it doesn't matter, because by then opinions have been formed, their communication to you has got out, and you now form an opinion. And we see this happening on a daily basis now, quite blatantly. I think any average psychology student can see what's being done out there. But my point is, that means the smallest opinions are now with the megaphone, with the loudest platform to speak from. But a person with a megaphone does not represent the people. And often you'll find if you talk to 10 people in a day, The media will be saying one thing, but if you talk to 10 people in actual conversations, them 10 people will think the opposite. But as I said, we're in a time now people are silent. They won't share their opinion through fear of condemnation or even losing friends. So my point is, the reality we see today is not what it appears to be. When you need a conversation, feel free to speak to God. God is listening. But when we turn off that megaphone, so it's not the loudest voice in the room, when we turn off our devices, when we sit on our own and we can find our own opinions again, we can find our own voice, we can re-establish our own truth. In that quiet place of knowing ourselves, there can be another voice. And that's the Spirit of God speaking to us. God is always there speaking to us. So if you're feeling alone in the world, you need to get to the quiet place. And the quiet place is simply start turning off your devices. Stop listening to a handful of people's views that just happen to have the megaphone in their hand. Start to re-establish your views. Go and talk to actual people. Realise that your views are not just yours. Many people share your views, but they simply won't speak out anymore. In fact, they won't even share their opinions in fear. Truth will always find its way. People that don't like truth will always try and shut it down. Simple measure of what you're seeing out there today. Truth is freedom. Those who stand against truth, who want to push a narrative, will try and shut it down. God is always listening, and he will always respond. But today, that quiet place is drowned out by noise, and you need to find that quiet place again. That's where faith comes in. Have faith that God gave you a purpose. God still wants that purpose for you. He sees what lays ahead, and he always has an answer prepared. But in all communication, we need to be listening, we need to be sharing, and we need dialogue. So find your quiet place, re-establish your views and opinions so you can start from a basis. Then talk to others, because God often speaks through other people. Learn and grow from the answers, especially the uncomfortable ones. And when you find that very quiet place, you'll hear the Spirit of God, because he'll always lead you to the truth and a better place. You guys have a blessed week out there. God bless.
If you were blessed by this video, why not give it a like? Also subscribe to this channel and hit the bell icon to be notified of future videos.